Good afternoon, and welcome to the first in a series of conversations sponsored by the Associated Press Media Editors, in which we will be examining journalistic issues with the goal of learning best practices for our own newsrooms. My name is Carlos Sanchez, and I'm a member of the APME board, as well as executive editor of the Monitor newspaper in McAllen, Texas. Joining me is co-host Autumn Phillips, a fellow APME board member and executive editor of the Quad City Times in Davenport, Iowa. Now, this is our first Google Hangout, so pardon any jitters. While you can see us, we cannot see you, but that doesn't mean we can't hear from you. You should be able to see along the right side of your screen a dialog box. If at any time during this presentation you have a question or comment, simply type it in at the bottom right and hit enter. We should be able to immediately see your question, and we will endeavor to answer them all. Right now, I'd like to pass you along to Autumn, who will introduce our guest.
Good afternoon. Our guest today is Brian Carovillano, Vice President for U.S. News at the Associated Press. He's based in New York. Brian will be talking to us about AP's response to the recent deadly nightclub shooting in Orlando. Brian joined the AP in 2000 and worked as a reporter and editor in Rhode Island, Boston, and San Francisco. In 2008, Brian became regional editor for the Southern United States and helped direct coverage of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. In 2010, he moved to Bangkok to lead AP's coverage of the Asia-Pacific region, and in 2014, Brian became managing editor for U.S. News. Welcome, Brian. Can you begin by walking us through the first hours of AP coverage and how you first learned about the Orlando shooting?
Sure, and thanks Autumn and Carlos, and I'm happy to be here chatting with everybody and happy to take questions and hope I can answer them. So this story, as everybody I think knows, started around 2 a.m. When Omar Mateen entered the Pulse nightclub and started shooting, and then it actually went on for 3 hours. Until around 5 a.m. the police broke through the wall into the bathroom of Pulse and ended up shooting Mateen and saving some of the folks who had survived. So there was a long period of time, and there was an AP reporter and photographer on scene for a lot of that time. And the reporter is a guy named Mike Schneider, who's been covering, he's been our Orlando correspondent for a number of years, and a freelance photographer that he works with regularly named Phelan Ehrenbach. And the two of them were on the scene even as Mateen was still inside shooting. In Mike's case, he was alerted when his news editor called him about 3 a.m. and told him to get to the scene, and so he was there for a good long chunk of the time that the standoff was happening between the cops and Mateen. I was
Brian,
alerted.
if I could interrupt, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How did you know that the news editor, him or herself, how did they know that there was something going on? Do you have an overnight desk, or how does that work?
We monitor on the overnights from the regional desk, which in this case is in Orlando, is in Atlanta, I'm sorry, and from here in New York, where we have what we call the Nerve Center, and they're kind of monitoring social media and broadcasters all around the world, and just making sure that in the instances where things are going on and we need to alert folks, they're the ones who are most likely to know to call the local news editor and make sure we get staff to the scene. And so a lot of what they do is just sort of sifting through a lot of stuff happening all over the place and trying to figure out what are the ones that are worth raising alarm bells on. And this one pretty clearly from the beginning was something that was worth scrambling some people to get to. We obviously didn't know at that point just how big this would be. And over the course of the morning it really unfolded in kind of a shocking way, because it was, we've had a lot of mass shootings, unfortunately, and a lot of them in the past couple years, and it wasn't really clear until, say, mid-morning that this was something really particularly bad, because the death toll was at about 20, which is that's already really one of the worst we've seen, and then it jumped to 50 around, I think it was 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, and that's when it was clear that this was one of the worst things that we had seen. And eventually they went back to 49, so it was 50 total, including the shooter.
Now, Brian, you said, unfortunately, you are in the habit of being able to cover a lot of mass shootings. Do you now have a protocol in place? Is there something that you know to do immediately, logistically?
Well, it depends a little bit on the scale of the event, right? So yes, I mean the answer unfortunately is yes. These happen often enough where kind of a template for how we cover them. And I could talk a little bit about how we divide the story up into buckets and give each bucket an owner and all that. But I think in this case, like, this was a much worse mass shooting than anything we've seen in recent memory. And so some of the protocol that we used goes beyond what we would do in, it feels unfortunate to be using this language, but in a a more ordinary situation. In this case, it was more like the way we would cover a big ongoing story. I was involved in coverage, for example, of Hurricane Katrina and of the tsunami and the nuclear crisis in Japan, and some of the stuff that I learned and some of the protocol that we used in those cases we actually used in this instance.
Now, Brian, the other component of it is how quickly did your reporter on the scene begin putting out information, and was he in a position where he could actually feed something to you and get the information out online immediately?
Yeah, as soon as he got to the scene, we were filing. There's an editor in Atlanta named Greg Schreier who was logged on to the system from his dining room table and was filing updates in real time using a format that we call the latest, which is like a live blog, almost immediately after Mike got there. So, and then it just kind of we build it from there.
Is that a two-step process? I mean, is it? I mean, in old days, it was taking dictation and somebody rewriting. In this case, was it a matter of taking his blog post and putting them up in Atlanta? How did that work?
Well, for us, it's still a two-stage process. We don't generally have folks filing from the field directly to the wire. That we do keep the safeguard in place, but honestly, Carlos, like, dictating from the scene is still in some ways the fastest way to get information out to the world. And so, Mike is dictating to Greg, and Greg is filing to the world in some cases. I mean, in other cases it might be easier to use text messaging or email. But generally, somebody's not logging on with a laptop and writing into our CMS and being edited. It's usually by any means necessary to get the news out as quickly as possible. But it generally always goes through an editor.
Hey, Brian, we have a question from Dennis Anderson in Peoria. He asked, how important was it to file to Twitter and Facebook during the initial reporting?
AP's model is somewhat unique in that we're a licensing business, right? And so we provide breaking news to our customers first, and to our members, and to the folks who are paying the AP for the content, and then we file to Twitter. And I think that's a different situation than most consumer-facing platforms are, where they're using that as the fastest way to get information. Now, in this case, we're talking about seconds in between, but when an alert goes out, it goes out to customers first, and then it goes out to the rest of the world on Twitter. But it is important. It's where a lot of people get news. It's also a great tool in these situations for gathering news. And one of the things we do, and certainly did in this story, is we have editors around the country whose job it is to be using social as a news gathering tool, and looking for UGC that we could begin to publish. Because while we had a photographer on the scene very early on, a lot of the images and some of the video that we get are actually coming from users who are at the scene.
Brian, one thing that became clear during Katrina was that networks, mobile networks, become quickly overloaded, and the ability to text is probably one of the few abilities to communicate. Did you ever encounter that here in Orlando?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's usually more like a big natural disaster type thing. If it happened, it wasn't on my radar, and I don't know that it did in this case.
Okay. And when did you personally get involved in the coverage? How did that happen?
It was about 5 a.m. after the cops went in and the whole thing ended. I got a call from the folks here on the Nerve Center, and immediately saw that there were a whole bunch of push alerts on my phone, and then was involved from that point on. I came into the office later that morning, and it was where it went from like 20 to 50 that we really started ramping things up and sending more and more people in.
Brian, we got a question.
Oh, go ahead.
It's from Jack Lale. It says, on the Sunday of the shooting, how many AP people were engaged primarily in covering this story?
By the end of the day, we had about 20 people on the ground in Orlando, including reporters, photographers, video journalists. I sent a couple of editors in. We set up a remote editing station. We got a hotel conference room in Orlando, and sent down one of our top breaking news editors and another person named Evan Berland, who's one of the supervisors here at the Nerve Center, to kind of coordinate and make sure everybody on the ground was working together. And then we have a really good writer who's there working with the two of them, making sure that everything that's coming in from the folks in the field. It's kind of like the more people you have, the more organized you need to be to make sure that things just don't go into chaos. So by the end of that day, we had about 20 people on the ground there across formats.
Now, you talked about getting verbal or text communication almost immediately. How did multimedia work, and how quickly were you able to get images and other multimedia up and available to your customers?
Images as quickly as we are with the text, because again, we had a photographer on the scene. His photos were on the fronts of newspapers and prominently featured, on every portal by, hours later, and certainly the next morning. So there was images that were out there very quickly, and then you kind of build out from there. What you do with that. We were able to get up-pick video from local affiliates in Orlando while scrambling our own video journalists to the ground to get original AP stuff, and it builds out from there. And then, of course, then you start using that to package it in different ways, produce interactive content that goes into the interactive bucket. That takes a little bit longer, but we had folks on doing that during the day on Sunday also. So in terms of images, it's minutes, and video, up-pick video within minutes, as quickly as we're getting text out.
Can you tell us the process for video? Initially, what I'm gathering is it's fairly raw video, maybe 30 seconds, 40-second snippets, and then you package it later. Is that how it works?
Yes and no. We get video from a lot of different sources. So we have partnerships with affiliates in almost every major market, and so we can access their video. We have our own video journalists who are primarily focused on producing raw, loosely edited video for broadcasters to then customize and put their own scripts and language against it. And then we do produced, packaged, voiced video that's primarily for online and mobile use, and that usually takes a little bit longer and is a little bit more labor intensive. So it's what you described. The looser, rawer stuff can obviously get out faster than the stuff that's more packaged and produced and is more immediate, and there's more of a demand for that as it goes. But it's also partly because it just takes longer to do the production around the online video. So all of these things flow into different AP products, and we're producing video for a lot of different platforms, and all of those platforms have different needs in terms of what we produce. And of course, like all of you, we have a lot of folks who aren't career video folks, but who are equipped with iPhones and trained to use Videolicious or Bamboozer or Periscope. So in a sense, every AP journalist everywhere who's got a phone in their pocket is a video journalist. But then we also have, really top-level TV-style video journalists, and in this case, we had several of those folks on the scene over the course of the day on Sunday, including a guy named Joshua Plogel, who is an AP video journalist in Miami, who actually worked at Pulse to put himself through college when he was going to Central Florida University. So he ended up actually writing a really great first-person piece about, what that experience did for him and how it changed his life, and then how horrifying it was to go back and be a journalist on the ground covering the mass shooting there.
That was a fascinating piece, and it stood out because it was first person. Was there any hesitation about kind of breaking the mold of traditional reporting and going first person?
No, not in that case. We've done it with more frequency than we ever did before, and we've been a lot less conservative about it. But in this case, that's such an intensely personal story. I don't know how you would tell it without having him be the voice telling the story. I just think anything else would have really missed the point of what that experience was like for him. And he did it really well. That piece, and then there was another story that was basically just a text message exchange between a woman that Mike Schneider met in the very early goings outside the club and her son, who was inside the bathroom hiding from the shooter. And those two pieces, which were really smaller kind of sidebar type material, they did incredibly well on social and on our own mobile platforms. And I think one of the big lessons out of this story, which we know, but this was just really drove it home, and we have metrics to put against it, is how valuable that kind of shareable stuff is. That is really well suited to social platforms that are it's in addition to the coverage that we have always done really strong main bar, sidebars on the shooter and the victims and all of that stuff. But looking for those distinctive kind of stories that you're not going to get from any other news organization, those are really valuable. And this story really, and this particular story, this event, really drove home how important that is to factor into your planning around a big news event.
Can you walk us through a bit the distinction between the updates that seem more like blog posts versus write-throughs, so that it's a traditional in traditional journalistic format? At what point do you pull the trigger on either?
We call it the latest, but yeah, it's really kind of a running blog post. It's got timestamps. We started doing it in the past couple years because that's how people read news on mobile platforms and on more immediate. They want the latest information first. And what we've always done traditionally in our business is we put the most important information first. And what we realized is we kind of have to do both. So we start the latest basically in any breaking news situation that's going to require multiple updates. So if your first word is there's been a shooting at a club, you put that out, and then the next is there are multiple injuries, you put that out. 6 people are dead, you put that out. 20 people are dead, 50 people are dead, and you just kind of keep building on that, and you're putting the most recent update at the top. Now that works great for that kind of immediate as the story is breaking thing, but it's not a substitute for the more traditional, like the lead of the story tells you what you need to know, what is the most important thing that happened. So we do both, and they're sort of unlinked from each other. We're filing the latest, even as we're also keeping that more kind of newspaper-style story, for lack of a better term, up to date. And so first we update the latest, and then we immediately go into the main bar, which is the write-through, and make sure that that information gets added to that as quickly as possible and in the place where it belongs. Whether it belongs at the top of the story or in the 16th paragraph really depends on what the development is.
And where along the food chain is somebody doing the write-through? Is it New York, Atlanta? How does that work?
It's in Atlanta until we get the remote filing center set up. So in this case, as I was saying, we rented a hotel conference room in Orlando, and then we had the filing all moved there. So by the end of the day on Sunday, we had editors who were keeping the write-throughs and the latest going from Orlando.
Can you tell us a little bit about chain of command? I mean, you got involved about 5 a.m. Were you working directly with reporters on the scene, or were you working through Atlanta? How does that work?
No, I work through the regional editor, who in this case is a guy named Robbie Nessman. He's based in Atlanta. He really owns the story and the pieces of the story. On any big story, we assign what we call a story owner, and everything needs to flow through that person. That's the person who needs to know where everybody is, what they're doing, where we need to be, which way is the story going. They're kind of the strategic planner of the story, and that's important, especially when you have a lot of people on the ground and a lot of people contributing to the story from elsewhere, to just have a sense of who's doing what and what are our needs and how does that fit into what the coverage plan is for the day. That person's not getting their hands on the keyboard. They're not editing the stories. They're not writing the stories. They're kind of the traffic cop, the person who knows that everything's going on. I work through that person on these stories, and so I'm looking at everything as it's going out, providing my feedback, weighing in on the plan, but taking a little bit more of a distant view, because that's how the audience is looking at it, and that's really valuable. And you tend to get this thing where the people who are really down in the story sometimes tend to get so into it that a little bit removed focus is really valuable, and so that's the role that I try to play. I'm not saying, send that reporter there to ask this question so much as what are the broad themes we want to cover today? Where do we think the story's going? And then it's up to Ravi to figure out how to put the pieces in place to make sure we get that. And also to turn on a dime when the story changes. If suddenly the story becomes about shooter's wife, we need to start changing our focus. It might not be what we thought we were going to put our resources into earlier in the day.
What about logistical support? The notion of, for example, getting that hotel room and sending people from other parts of the country there. Is that something you handle, or does the story owner handle that?
The story owner really handles that kind of stuff. I mean, we'll bring in help. We sent up an AP technology staffer from Miami to help get that set up and make sure they had the connectivity and the communications and everything that they were going to need. We have an office manager in Miami who got us the hotel rooms and was sort of dealing with the logistics. I try to keep the journalists and the logistics separated from each other. And so if I have to provide whatever help I can on the logistics side, I'd much rather the editors and the reporters focus on the journalism and not start having to worry about things like satellite phones and hotel rooms and the logistical things that can sometimes be a distraction from the journalism. And then the next thing you know, it's like 6 o'clock and you don't have the basics that you need for the story that day.
Okay. Now this question comes from Jack Lale. It says, can you talk about how your reporter was able to talk to the family members waiting for information from authorities at the hotel?
Yeah, this is a good story, actually. So 2 reporters who were on the scene, a guy named Harris, who is, along with Mike Schneider, the other writer who's based in Orlando, and Tamara Lush, who was driving up from Tampa. Between the 2 of them, they figured out what hotel the families were staging at, and they got on the phone and they booked a room in that hotel before the police thought to ban the media from accessing that hotel. So Tamara was checked into that hotel and in a room, and she was interviewing families of victims all day, and some of those are people that Mike had met outside the club. I'll do more in-depth interviews with, and some of them was new material. So if you look back at the coverage that day, what I think was really illuminating and exceptional was that we had a lot of in the club because families were in touch with their loved ones who were in there hiding from the shooter and were communicating them by phone and by text message. And all of those interviews took place in this hotel room. And as far as we know, we were the only news organization who was actually in the hotel with the families and ended up interviewing a significant number of, more than a dozen, I think, family members. And that day we were able to put together late in the day at the beginnings of a narrative of like, here's what unfolded inside the club and what people were doing and what that was like for people who were there, which, usually it takes 2 or 3 days to really get that kind of reporting in this type of situation. And the just basic, there's nothing fancy or technological about figuring out what's the hotel where the families are going to be at and getting yourself a room there. That's just good, smart, old-fashioned reporting and, thinking on your feet and trying to get there.
One thing about social media is that a lot of information flows into you as a reporter. How do reporters handle information from people like family members who are hungry for any tidbit of information? Are they cautioned from providing, this is what I've heard, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't put anything out on the wire or out on any of our platforms that isn't, confirmed. What I heard usually doesn't cut it for us. It has to be something like, here's the text of the messages I was getting from, from my son who was in the bathroom. And we have social media editors in each region, and they are a huge help in kind of sifting through all of the noise and helping to find the stuff that really matters and is worth paying attention to, and then delivering that to the folks who are on the scene so they can go track down those people and hopefully get them on camera and interview them. We can reach a lot of people on the phone. We can do a lot of reporting from somewhere else. And in this case, we did a lot of reporting from Chicago and from other parts of the country here in New York. But there's no substitute for obviously getting the face-to-face interviews with people, and especially doing that on camera. And I think the video with the family member that everybody watched at the beginning here just shows how much more powerful that is to hear in the person's voice what was happening and what they were experiencing at the time, rather than read the words in a quote or in a story.
Brian, we have another question from Peter Rasmussen. How often are you guys meeting and planning big breaking news situations, whether something like on a giant scale like this or even smaller? And what are those meetings like?
On a smaller scale, it usually gets incorporated into our daily meetings. So we meet, we have a big global news meeting at 9:15, and we do that by video conference because we have the story owners of the top stories in the world will be calling in by video conference and telling us about their coverage plans. And it's very all formats focused. It's what is the plan for text, what is the plan for video, what is the plan for photos, do we have interactive plans around that? And so that gets incorporated into, we have a 9:15 global meeting, a 10 o'clock meeting that's focused on U.S. news, and then at 4:30 kind of a check-in on how all that stuff worked out and then what's the plan going into the night and the next day. When we have a big story like this, and this is a really big story, but on a story even significantly smaller than this, we'll have specific planning meetings just to talk about this story and get all the players, including usually some of the folks in the field, call in, tell us what they're seeing, tell us, who they're talking to, what those folks are saying, and from that we can kind of formulate a plan. And we try and give people some broad sense of this is what we think the main themes are. Let's focus on reporting out, the shooter's wife, the 3-hour time lapse and what happened with that, and try and give people some sense of, this is what we see as the game plan for the day, with the flexibility to change that. And then we'll usually hold another meeting sometime in the early to mid-afternoon, so we can take stock of the reporting that's been done in the ensuing hours and decide, okay, what stories does that flow into? Who's going to handle the writing? Who's going to handle the editing? What do we have? What are the video elements for that? What are the photo elements for that? And then also a look ahead at, okay, well, going into the afternoon and the evening, what do we expect are going to be the main themes? And then in some cases, like in the first couple days, we'll check in a third time late in the day, kind of after that day's stories are all already out on the wire, and start talking about planning for the next day. So it really depends a lot on the scale of the story.
Now, Brian, one thing that we need to acknowledge is that the resources that AP has are much more significant than any of the individual newsrooms that we lead. Would you have any advice for smaller newsrooms with more limited resources on perhaps either a protocol or initial steps to take when one realizes that this is a significant news event?
You can do a lot from somewhere else. So in the case of this story, we divided the reporting up into essentially 4 buckets. One was the investigation of what actually happened in the club. One was about the shooter. One was about the victims, and one was kind of the LGBT story, or LGBT bucket, which was kind of like reaction and what this means to that community. The victims bucket we assigned to the central desk in Chicago, and they did all the reporting for that there on the phone, and they got profiles and photos of all 49 victims, which we were able to put together into an interactive presentation. And so I think one important tip is, you don't have to be there on the scene standing outside the club to contribute to the coverage. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind is, if it's an all-hands-on-deck story, use as many resources as you have. If it's 2 people or it's 20 people or it's 200 people, it's some stories sweep everything else off the table. And you have to pick your spots. You can't cover everything, so you try and focus on what you see as the most important. What are the most important threads? What are the most important buckets that day that you're going to focus on? Sometimes you make the wrong decision. I think over time we get enough experience where we can say, if we can only cover 2 main elements of the story, these are the 2 main elements we're gonna focus on, and then hopefully the next sentences, and then we'll rely on AP for everything else.
You talked about 4 buckets. What about the policy-making or political bucket that invariably ensues a situation like this? How is that handled?
Yeah, and obviously, that's like a 5th bucket, really. I mean, that's a good point. And in this case, that's the most lingering one, I think, because even the sit-in that was happening in the House that began yesterday and into this morning, I mean, that's still part of the Orlando story, right? And so what happens in terms of assault weapons and gun legislation, I mean, that's going to be something that is going to carry on and permeate into the political bucket, just like almost a whole other the campaign piece of this. And so you kind of have to be flexible on that. You can't decide on Sunday, these are the buckets, and but you have to every day be looking at, okay, is this a new thing that we're going to have to put some resources against and assign somebody to kind of own that and make sure it happens. And when you're creating those buckets, for me, it's really important to make sure that someone's in charge of it. So if we say, in the immediate aftermath of the Pulse shooting, the LGBT theme is really important to us, to then say to someone who's you really trust to drive it, please own this and report back to us on what your plans are around this, and then make that flow into kind of the central. And in the case of the victims, I mean, again, that was actually mostly done in Chicago. So it's just a matter of making the most of the resources you do have, whatever those resources are.
Excellent.
At some point, Brian, you made a standards call. You mentioned about not calling this the largest mass shooting in history. Do you want to talk about that and how you communicated it to the field?
Yeah. So a number of hours into the story, we had alerted and repeatedly called it the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. And we heard from a lot of readers and some members that that's not actually accurate. It depends on how you define mass shooting, because there have been massacres of Native Americans and race riots and, a number of things that happened, particularly in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. I mean, a lot of really bad stuff has happened in this country. And we looked at that and we thought, they have a point. And so we essentially just added a word. We said, this is the worst mass shooting in recent or modern U.S. history, which is not a big change, but it felt more accurate, more sensitive. It felt like the right thing to do. We blasted that out to the whole staff by email. We ended up producing a story and a separate blog post on the AP Corporate Communications blog explaining the thinking behind it. But it really was drawn to our attention by readers who were seeing the story online and saying, what about Wounded Knee, and what about some of these other incidents that happened? And so we kind of made the call on the fly to change that wording a little bit, and it felt like the right thing to do. I think it was the right thing to do.
Okay, we have another question from Peter Rasmussen. What about overtime costs for everyone working this story? How do you guys make those decisions? Is budget a factor in covering these large-scale breaking news stories?
Yeah, budget is a huge factor. And, when you have a story that's this big, you want to be able to say, budget be damned, we're going to throw everything we have at it. And we kind of do in the early goings, with the understanding that we're going to have to really claw back savings in other areas over the course of the next month or two to make sure that we stay on budget. But I don't want to be reluctant to send the right people in to cover a story of this magnitude. I'll worry about that later. But what we do differently now, I would say, than we did in the past is we back away the resources that we put into the story a little more quickly than we did in the past. And I think that's partly audience behavior, that the stories it's a sad statement, but, that people's attention spans don't seem as long, and so, on Wednesday, in the case of this story, we're already seeing kind of interest dropping off in a lot of our usage metrics. And I remember having a conversation that day with Ravi and some of the other people involved, like, there's still great stories to be done here, and really important stories, and we're going to do those stories, and we're going to make people care about it. And actually, after that day, some of the stories we did, particularly profile of the shooter's wife, the second wife, was one of the most popular stories we did the whole week in terms of mobile usage and shareability and all of the things that we use to measure usage. So we kind of did make people care about it. But then there's the budget consideration too. Maybe in the past you'd have left people there a few extra days or a few extra weeks in the case of like a Katrina or a Gulf oil spill, and you're thinking about, do we need to pull out some of the out-of-state folks more aggressively? And start thinking about the budget. But as the story's breaking, as you've got 50 dead on the ground, I'll deal with the repercussions of the budget. I'll find other ways to save money. I'll get us back on track for the next few weeks and months. But I don't want to sit there at 5 o'clock in the morning and have to make a decision on how to cover a story of this import based solely on finances.
Brian, we have a question from Adam Ratton. Considering the increased accessibility of live video, are you considering trying to get reporters and people in the field to tell these stories on the fly?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we make great use of live video already. We have a few different channels that we use for live video. I mean, we were able to, with the real TV quality video cameras, we use something called live view units, which I think probably some of you guys might be using in your newsrooms, and that allows us to stream live video directly into the newsrooms of AP subscribers around the world. So that's one thing. That's sort of at the top end. We use an app called Bamboozer, which allows you to stream live video from your iPhone into our newsroom, which from there we can kind of send it out, so that'll go into New York or London, and we're able to kind of transmit that to everyone. And then obviously in some cases, as in the case last night of the congressional sit-in, we'll use Periscope or some of the other apps that folks are using just to get the video out. So increasingly we have anyone who's an AP journalist in the field can use one of these live video apps. It's really more a matter of awareness and making sure the person knows to do this. And we've had some pretty good success stories where persons shown up on the scene of a story, and their first thought was to get the live video going before they started doing any other reporting. One of the best examples is there was a huge skyscraper in Dubai that was on fire a few months ago, and the reporter on the scene, a guy named John Gambrell, started streaming live video, and it was, you know, instantly being broadcast by like the BBC and ABC News, and so from his phone, standing on the street in Dubai, as this event was really just beginning, people were already watching that live video around the world.
Another question from Peter Rasmussen. Do you have somebody on standby who does background checks, things of that nature, or is that something the reporters are primarily tasked with doing?
Yeah, we have a small but very capable research team here in New York and one person in Washington, and they do a lot of that stuff for us. So they're standing by waiting to get a name of the shooter in that case, and then, you know, using a lot of different research tools to try and find as much information and feed that out to the folks who are in the field. That doesn't absolve the reporters who are covering the story from doing some of that work themselves, but we do have some research support here, and that's a huge asset to the AP in these situations, because you want your reporters out there knocking on doors, getting out on the street, and there's some research that can be done from afar, and the folks at the News Research Center here in New York really help with that.
Okay. Well, it's now approximately 12:45 Central Time, so we're going to conclude this conversation. APME will have a link to this video on its homepage, apme.com, and we encourage you to share this with others. I'd like to thank Autumn for setting this up, and in particular, I'd like to thank Brian for being our first guest. And I'd like to wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.